Okay, here we go. Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 534, interview with Becky about her new book, Spitfires, The American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II. Her previous books include Off the Cliff, How the Making of Thelma and Louise Drove Hollywood to the Edge, and Saturday Night Widows, The Adventures of Six Friends Remaking Their Lives. Becky, if I may, thank you very much for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I just finished your book. I'm looking forward to it because I think is it coming out today or very soon, right?
This is the day, yes.
Oh, well, all right, great. Okay, so let me just start with this because as the father of four daughters, I'm gonna read a sentence from your book, and when I read this, bearing in mind that I have four daughters, this just made me laugh out loud. So here's the sentence: beset by death, blackouts, deprivation, and a perfectly rational fear that Hitler would wipe the nation off the map, the United Kingdom was so desperate for ferry pilots that it accepted some who had lost arms, eyes, legs. It took pilots who were too old for the Royal Air Force, along with foreigners, members of any race, and yes, even women. Again, I laughed out loud because when I read that to my daughters, they had very unladylike language in response to that. But that's one of the ironies because the women you cover in your book are partly responsible for pushing the envelope, for pushing the edge of what is acceptable in regards to women's behavior. And you seem to gravitate towards that theme in some of your other books as well.
True. Any woman who knew how to fly back then was already breaking a lot of conventions.
Good
It was
point.
very rare. A lot of women didn't even know how to drive cars at that point. So these women were bold, they were mavericks, they were trailblazers, they were unafraid to go out there and be who they were and not worry about what society thought of them.
Yes, and you give a couple thousand examples of that in your book, and we're going to get to some of those. So, to set the story up, the British, like you said, are desperate, but not desperate enough to have women be fighter pilots, still, needs must. And some of these planes have to be moved around either after they're newly built or they're in need of repairs. And that's where the ATA comes in. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yeah, so the Air Transport Auxiliary, known as the ATA, or sometimes known as Anyone to Anywhere, various nicknames that they had. They were involved in moving aircraft to and from the airfields. Now, that sounds kind of boring, but in fact, it was a very dangerous job. One
Right.
in seven of these pilots were killed during the course of the war. The reason is that there was a huge need to ramp up the manufacture of aircraft so quickly. These aircraft were rolling off the assembly lines and were barely tested. So these pilots would take them up in the air. Frequently, they had failures in the aircraft, sometimes fatal. They also faced terrible weather in
Mm,
the British Isles, where frequently they would run into clouds and storms, and they were not allowed to fly with instruments. So that was also very dangerous. A lot of them would smack into a mountainside or something. And the third thing that made it really dangerous was the other part of their job was returning aircraft that had been damaged in fighting
right.
to maintenance units for repair. And they frequently had no idea what was wrong with this aircraft till they were high in the sky. Many of them had missing doors, they were full of bullet holes, they had parts that had been damaged. And these pilots had to be really brave to jump in those aircraft and take off in them.
Right. Like most people, you see a plane fly overhead and you fantasize about getting your pilot license. And then I read your book and I'm like, no, I'm good because I don't need a plane to just cut off. I don't need the wind to hit me. No, it truly was terrifying. And you make this point in your book. They were being disparaged because they weren't like, they don't have a lot of muscle mass or testosterone, but what they had was emotional and intellectual courage. And that's what it took because, and I've lost count of the number of times, and you said in your book, this horrible thing happened, and yet she stayed calm, and yet she stayed composed because you had to be able to think your way through a problem and not just panic like a lot of men would just assume that they would do.
hmm at the beginning of their service, there was a lot of speculation about who would excel.
Mm,
And Many thought that the most experienced pilots might excel. A few thought maybe the less experienced because they were more daring and didn't know
Right.
what they were facing and would just do it. Um, what turned out in the end to be predictive was those who could have absolutely steady nerves in any situation. Things
Right.
frequently went wrong. They had to quickly assess their options. They had to decide, can I get this aircraft down on a field somewhere? Can I glide the aircraft if the engine has failed? Can
Right.
I get through this cloud without using instruments? They had to think quickly and calmly and act appropriately. So those who made it through to the end were rock solid personalities.
Right. And you demonstrate that time and time in your book. And this was dangerous. I mean, like you said a couple of minutes ago, lives were lost. And so this is not for the faint of heart. So the other thing that I found strange, but maybe I shouldn't have, was there's no American version of this. It's not like these American women were flying for the U.S. Army Air Force and just decided to go across the Atlantic. As far as I can tell, for right now, the ATA is the only game in town, and these women are seeking opportunity. They want to fly, they love flying, but they also want more out of life, with all due respect, than just marriage and children.
Right. They all wanted to serve in the war, and the United States military would not permit that. Now, after they started in the ATA in England, the US was watching very carefully to see how these women did. There was a lot of
Mm,
pressure on them. And as a result, they started what's known as the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots.
right.
And that was somewhat similar to the ATA in that they did do aircraft deliveries within the United States. It was new aircraft primarily, and it was a very different program, much more regimented. The ATA in England was very freewheeling. It had started up as a seat of the pants operation, and there were few rules. In the United States, it was more controlled. But the big difference was that there was always a segment of popular opinion that opposed women being in cockpits. And so the WASP was controversial from the beginning. And in 1944, it was ended over concerns that women might someday take jobs away from men who were pilots. Even though the war was still raging, they stopped the program and women had no opportunities at that point. The ATA
Hmm.
treated women quite equally. At the beginning, they got 20% less pay, but after about a year, when the Americans were there, they got equal pay. At first, they were only allowed to fly the most basic aircraft. By the end, they were allowed to fly all the aircraft that men flew. So it was a really utopian situation for
Right.
women pilots that they got to live the dream during these war years.
Exactly. What is that saying? Necessity is the mother of invention. And the British, like you said, were desperate. And they didn't have time to be, if I may, sexist. They're like, if you got the skills, we need you. That kind of, because it literally was life and death. And it's unfortunate that it takes moments like that to get beyond our rigid thinking. But we'll get into some of that. So if I remember correctly, there are several groups of women that come over. I think it's like four or five groups starting in 1942. And like you just touched on, and this was my daughter's, all four of them, second favorite part of the book. We'll get to the first one later. But when the women get over there, they're freer than they've ever been. They basically get to live like, if you'll excuse me, they get to live like men. And on one hand, this is liberating. This is awesome. They get to be themselves. On the other hand, this is not a game. This is not a joke. They either measure up to what is needed or they're out of there. And that's going to happen as well. So on one hand, liberty. On the other hand, you've got to be able to deliver the goods.
That's right. It was a tough job. Many people didn't make it to the end. Some were seriously injured. Uh, there was a fatality amongst the Americans, and some left to go join the WASP, thinking that might be better, and they realized the mistake they'd made when the WASP ended. Uh,
Right.
a few left because they got married, one got pregnant. There were various reasons why they didn't all make it through to the end, but in general, their record was exemplary. The
Yeah.
Americans had a very high rate of successful deliveries and very few crashes compared to others. Part of it was that they were so skilled that when they got into dicey situations, they were able to get their way out of it because of the experience they'd had back home before they came over.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, or I don't remember all of it, but some of them were crop dusters. Some of them performed in air shows. I mean, it wasn't just take off, fly a little bit, land. They were experienced. They brought the goods and they needed them because, like you said, half the time these planes would act up, and then what do you do now?
Right. One of the pilots was named Hazel Jane Rains, and she came from what she called a hat and gloves church-going family in
Right.
Georgia. Uh, she studied music in college. Um, After college, she took a few air lessons and loved it, as all these people did. And she wound up joining something called the Georgia Air Races and Show, which I can only imagine her family's reaction. She performed loop-de-loops and she performed controlled spins where she would spin toward the ground and the audience would scream in terror and she would save the plane at the last moment. That experience turned out to be extremely valuable in the war because she had one of the worst uh, flight situations of any of the pilots. She was flying a new Spitfire and the engine failed completely
Right.
right as she entered a huge cloud bank and she lost all visibility. So she knew she had to try to turn around to get back to an airfield of some sort that she had
Hmm.
passed. And but of course, turning with no visibility meant that she lost the lift of the plane because she couldn't tell up from down.
Right.
And the Spitfire went into an uncontrolled spin that would have driven it straight into the ground. There was nothing she could do but hang tight until she broke out of the clouds. At that point, she really didn't have enough room to save herself.
Mm.
But because of her experience in the air show, she did everything right. She got the Spitfire leveled out. She still crashed, but she was at least horizontal. And thank God she ran into a cottage with a thatched roof that had 3 feet of straw on top. It saved her life. The Spitfire was totaled, but she emerged in front of everyone in this village, and they were completely shocked when this pilot jumped up, blood streaming down her face, and realizing that this was not the man they were expecting to find
Right.
dead in the cockpit, but it was a woman and an American woman. Uh,
Wow. Yeah. I mean,
Experience that she had was really valuable. Now, some had less of that kind of experience,
right.
but over the course of the war, they got a lot of practice dealing with tough situations, and those who made it to the end were all very good at handling these kinds of emergencies.
Right. And if I remember correctly, I mean, like the GIs that are eventually going to come over into the war, I mean, these ladies come from a varied background. Like you said, some of them were had very simple, basic upbringing. Some of them more affluent families. Could you give us another example? Maybe Virginia Fair or whoever, but I just want the people to get a sense of the diversity of these, if you could, representatives coming over to the UK during their desperate hour.
Yes. When I started researching the book, I thought, how am I going to keep all these pilots straight? Well, it was not hard at all. They were so different, such a cross section of American womanhood.
Right.
Carr, who you mentioned, was known as the Flying Socialite. She
Mm.
was a member of the family of the Western Union fortune, which was one of the largest fortunes in the country at the time. She
Right.
was expected to be a debutante and capture a wealthy husband. She had no interest in that whatsoever. She had the means to pay to learn to fly and wanted to be a flight instructor. When the war began, she was able to go to England and then she was able to live the life she wanted because she was far from her family's influence and
Right.
who she was. I'll give another example, if you'd like, of another varied
Please.
background. We've already heard about the stunt pilot. Uh, there was Dorothy Fury. She was from an impoverished background in New Orleans and only had an eighth grade education.
Right.
However, she was very beautiful and she was very intelligent and sort of imperious acting. She decided if she could get to England, she could reinvent herself as she pleased. She presented as sort of an American aristocrat because
Right.
she was intelligent, she was beautiful, and she recycled one red dress that she brought with her. The British assumed that people who had the means to become pilots were aristocratic. So everyone assumed that she was some sort of American heiress.
Right.
Years later, many still thought so. She had a series of interesting affairs with British aristocrats and wound up entering the British aristocracy herself with no one the wiser.
Right.
Just, I'll do one more for
Sure.
contrast.
Please.
Roberta Sandoz was a crop duster in California, and she earned extra money by performing a mock striptease in air shows where she would fly over the field and toss an item of clothing out each time she went by. And,
Right.
and she would land and emerge fully clothed, much to the disappointment of the crowd, at least some in the crowd, possibly.
Right.
Um, so she came from a completely different background. I'll do one more. Ann Wood was the president of her college class,
Right.
very ambitious, not much flying experience compared to the others, but
Mhm.
great social skills. When
Right.
she was in London on leave, she made connections with diplomats and journalists and generals and spies in order to have a network of people she could appeal to after the war to get a serious job in aviation, which she did manage to do.
Right. And we'll get to this a little later. I was, it was on one hand, they're living their life to the fullest because they could be dead the next day. On the other hand, they are starting to think about their future. There is going to be life after the war, and I love flying. Why does it have to come to an end? So we'll touch on that. And some of the nighttime activities, I'll keep it as clean as that. We'll get to because my daughters strongly responded to that. So we'll get to that. But to give people a sense of what, and again, this is just another reason to envy these ladies. Can you give us an idea? Because when I got to the ferrying classes, phases, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, what it is they had to work their way up. Nobody just jumps into a bomber. No one just jumps into a Spitfire. They had to prove themselves. Can you give us an idea of kind of the structure that they had to go through?
Yes, the training was quite limited, really, but
Mhm.
there were four classes of aircraft that the women could fly. The
Right,
first, they had to pass some tests in very light, small aircraft, single engine with open cockpits. And part of that was so that they would learn the geography of England, which was very confusing to most of the Americans.
right,
Once they passed a class, then they could fly any aircraft in that class. So they'd only flown one model, but then they were assigned to ferrying duties and they could be tossed any model in the class.
right.
Having never seen it before, they would get in and take off and fly it. They
Wow.
were given a booklet called Ferry Pilot's Notes. It fit in a pocket. It had one page on each aircraft, and they would skim it quickly before they took off to understand the parameters, the speed, of the various things they needed to know. And they would have to fly these aircraft with no experience. The second class was also single engine, but they were the fast, scary fighter planes that were iconic aircraft for Great Britain. The Hurricane fighter, the Spitfire fighter, all of the women were so excited to fly those aircraft. They could fly in excess of 300 miles an hour. They had huge horsepower compared to anything the Americans had flown before. When they reached that step where they could fly those aircraft, they were all very excited and got promotions. But then
Right,
they would fly any fighter aside from the ones they trained in. They couldn't train in a Spitfire, for example, because it was a single seater. So they couldn't fly a Spitfire till after they passed a flight test in something called the Harvard, which was a training version.
right.
The
Yeah.
third class was two-engine aircraft. They were very excited to do that also because they knew that that's what American Airlines would fly after the war for passengers, and they knew they could possibly get jobs that way.
Right.
The fourth class was larger, heavier uh, two-engine aircraft, the big bombers.
Hmm.
So there were also four engines. That was the next class up, and women eventually were allowed to fly those. Um, None of the Americans officially flew them because by the time they had reached the country, they didn't need more of those pilots, but some of them unofficially flew them.
Right. I enjoy that part of the book. So just to give the people a sense, I mean, these women are busy. It's like up because there was one episode and I didn't write it down. Somebody crashed in a plane or crash landed a plane and then she had to get back up and fly another plane the same day. I mean, these women are busy because like you said, they're quickly Britain and the Allies are quickly ramping up production of aircraft. They've got to be moved around, they've got to be repaired. So these women are they're burning the candle at both ends. On during the day, they are busy as heck, and at night, in various degrees, they're having the time of their lives.
Mhm. I marveled at their energy.
Yes, yes.
Obviously, there was a lot of adrenaline involved because I kept thinking after a day like that, I would
I'm
go home,
done.
jump
I'm
into
done.
bed. But there was a real spirit, not just among these people, but people in general in Great Britain during the war. Everyone knew that a bomb could drop on them at any moment.
Yeah.
Any moment could be their last. So a lot of them did burn the candle at both ends. And that wasn't unusual that these American women were doing it too.
Right. And going back to something you said earlier, I just found this because you don't think about it unless you're reading about it or you're in the situation. When they get over to the UK, no one knows who they are. They can make up a new name. They can make up a new, and some of them did for their own various reasons. But the chance to reinvent yourself, how could you not want to give in to that I just enjoyed. They were hell on wheels. Their hair was on fire, whatever expression you wanted to use. And when you clash that against the British stiff upper lip, the reticence, it made some very interesting interactions.
Yes, most of the early British women who flew for the ATA were from very upper crust backgrounds
Right.
because those were the people who could afford flying lessons.
Exactly.
The Americans came over, they assumed that the Americans are all very upper crust as well. They were quite scandalized at first at how rambunctious the Americans were. They just had a different upbringing. Even those who were from an upper crust in the United States, they were more open, they were louder, they were more free with their opinions. So at first there was a real conflict of cultures between the two, and
Right.
a lot of the British colleagues disapproved of the Americans. But then there were many incidents when the Americans proved their mettle in the air, and everyone realized we're dealing with people who are making a really valuable contribution here. So eventually they all became friends, and the Americans were highly respected by the end.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's you can do something for us or you can't in this desperate hour, and they could, so they were valued for that. There's one part of the book, and again, I wish I'd written it down, where, like you said, well, there's a saying, all's fair in love and war, and they all wanted to fly the Spitfire, the Hurricane. I mean, these beautiful planes that were making a difference in the war. And some of them would petition for it. Some of them would use romance to try to get into the cockpit. But there was one page where you're describing one of the ladies' reaction to flying the Spitfire, and it was almost like poetry. How she and the plane became one. It was an extension of her, and that was like the most beautiful paragraph or two that I'd ever read. I mean, these women were one with this machine, and it was like cutting edge technology for the time. And how can that not be an exhilarating experience?
The Spitfire was an iconic aircraft and a great achievement of British design. I said it's on the level of the Aston Martin sports car or the Mini.
Right.
It's a classic. It was a beautiful aerodynamic design. It was effective in battle.
Hmm.
People felt very grateful that the Spitfire had helped to save Great Britain during the Battle of Britain when Germany was pummeling it with bombers, and those Spitfire pilots went up one-on-one to do dogfights and save the country. Uh,
Right.
so everyone loved them. Women in particular loved the Spitfire. It had a small cockpit. They felt like they fit in it perfectly.
Right.
So well designed that it was beautifully responsive. One of them said you only had to think about what you wanted to do and it did it. They
Wow.
could spin and go up and down and go fast, and they did take advantage of the opportunity to put it through its paces sometimes. Uh,
Yeah, that
it was
must have been
it was
amazing.
a key moment for all of them when they first got into their Spitfire. One person said it was like I'd had a kick in the pants and suddenly I was at 1,000 feet.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, I remember
it,
that. Yeah.
it was so exciting to have that kind of power at your disposal.
Right. Very few of us will ever experience that, sad to say. But and the next question I have is going to sound obtuse, but that's the world we live in. Your book is a keen reminder that women have dreams too. They have aspirations. Just because they're not men doesn't mean that they don't, you know what I'm saying. So I think it was Mary who was young and beautiful, and she either wanted to be an actress, a movie star, or a pilot, and she gets her opportunity to be a pilot. They get to fly bombers, like you said, but they're also thinking of after the war with the civil aviation. And again, just like men do, they're planning out their lives, but they are running into the reality of these still limitations, not only in America but also Britain as well. There's going to be a road to hoe even after the war for these ladies.
This was a constant theme throughout the book. From the very beginning, they had their eye on the future. They
Yeah,
wanted to stay in the sky. They were hoping that the US military would become convinced that it should employ women pilots. Didn't
right.
happen many, many years. They hoped that American Airlines would recognize their experience. I mean, think of what they did.
Yeah,
Uh, who wouldn't want someone with that skill, that calm personality to be in front of the aircraft when you're in it in an emergency?
right.
So they really hoped that they could log enough experience so that it would be something that no one could deny when the war was
Exactly.
over. This person is the best pilot we have before us. Let's hire this person. So that was always their goal. And it was partly what made them so ambitious during the war. They wanted to advance to that next class of aircraft. They were competitive with each other about who would get there first.
Yes.
They wanted to participate in the wider war to an extent that people would realize how important their work had been. So they were really quite driven by personal ambition as well as their desire to save the world.
Exactly. So, could you tell, and this is just to give the people, the listeners, a little more flavor of the book. Could you tell us where the part where Lady Astor makes an appearance and she's talking to one of the pilots? And of course, this, like you were stressing a minute ago, these pilots are Americans. They're a little more, hey, cut all the fancy crap. I'm a plain talker. And you just watch as two cultures collide, but they work it out, I guess, in the end.
Yes, once again, this is the character Hazel Jane Raines, who had been a stunt pilot.
Right.
When she was injured and in the hospital, Lady Astor was the patroness of this hospital and visited her.
Mhm.
And Hazel Raines didn't recognize her. She was kind of tough on her. Lady Astor was saying, I can't believe a woman would fly. Offended Hazel very much. She stood up for herself. Next thing she knew, she was invited to spend a week at Lady Astor's home, the Cliveden Estate, which was near Windsor Castle and one of the most beautiful country homes in England.
Right.
Hazel wasn't sure why she was there, but by the end, Lady Astor confided that she had 4 eligible sons, and she had hoped one of them could marry Hazel.
Right. When you want to,
Think
sorry.
about it. She
Yeah,
said, sorry, I have a job to do right now, and I'm
exactly.
going to do it, and I wouldn't give that up even to marry an Astor.
Right. I can't think of a higher compliment than to have someone like Lady Astor and just think of, the creme de la creme. She's basically saying, I want your bloodline in my family. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I know you're an American, but you've got something. It's quite obvious. And I mean, that's the ultimate compliment as far as I can tell.
Well, Lady Astor herself was a very feisty person, and she served in Parliament.
Yes, that's true. Thank you.
First woman to serve in Parliament. Someone else technically did something different,
Right.
but she herself was outspoken and involved in the world, and she admired that in Hazel.
Yeah, absolutely. And to acknowledge that, and again, that the contributions they were making. If I could just take a moment, I just want to share with you a funny moment that I had with your book and my daughter. So it took me a week and a half to read your book because I'm taking notes along the way, coming up with questions. And at dinner each night, I'm sharing, the latest escapade like Lady Astor or the motorcycle wreck. Oh, it broke my heart. Anyway, so I'm telling them all these stories. And I get up the next day and I come into my office and my book is missing. I'm like, it was right here. That's okay. The publisher sent me 2 books. So I went to go look for my second book. That was gone. I went to go ask my wife because whenever I lose anything, I ask my wife where it's at. I go into the sunroom and my wife and 2 youngest daughters are sitting there with your 2 books, discussing them and going through there and finding these just dramatic, emotional stuff that just rips your heart out, but in a good way. How that is, but there's just these intense stories of human behavior, of human emotion, and yet at the end of the day, you have to go back to work. And that's what these women were doing is for everything they suffered, they want to stick to the job. And then I had to write to your publisher and go, excuse me, you offered to send me a PDF of the book. Could you please send it? Because my books have been stolen. So I never got them back. So anyway, so I'm glad they were able to send that. But But I mean, there's this book has everything. It's got the history, it's got the technicals, like the classes we were talking about, but it's also got the human interest story. And I think that's what is really going to resonate with a lot of people is we assume we take advantage, or we just assume so much, but it was women trailblazing like this that made much of today what it is.
That's right. And I'm glad to hear that because now that the book is out today,
Yeah,
uh, I'm very interested in people discussing it because you can agree or disagree with
right.
a lot of the decisions the pilots made. They were human and they made decisions based on their priorities, and not everyone had the same priorities. So I'm going to be very interested in how people react to them.
Right. And if I could just say, and you mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, but the WASP, the American version, starts, I think, in 42, ends in 44 because of, for various reasons. A lot of it, people men just assume that women can't do this or they shouldn't do that, which is more silly the more you think about it. But so that comes to an end. So that option is quickly cut off for them. And again, like you said, they're thinking about their careers, and suddenly what might have been a good transition for them has now been closed down in 44. And like you said, the war is still going on.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's one reason I like hearing that your daughters enjoyed reading the book was that this story has been lost to history.
Right.
People aren't aware that it happened. Almost no one has heard about it.
Yeah.
These women were the first American women to fly military aircraft. If you Googled that when I started, you didn't see it anywhere.
Right.
They were pretty much forgotten after the war. It was a busy time. The world moved on. They
Yeah.
didn't have a publicist out there or anything. Uh, so people really forgot that this moment had existed. But it is so important to let people know because anyone who doubts that a certain group of people doesn't have ability to do a certain kind of job, it's helpful to know that yes, at a time when there was little training for any of this, there was no special treatment of any kind. These women excelled. And so if I were young women thinking of wanting a career in aviation or thinking of wanting a career in anything where people assume women shouldn't be doing it, it's a good story to know that these people overcame all of that a long time ago.
Yes. Yes. And the short version of that is what my daughter said. They basically, when they finished the book, they were like, well, we got a couple more heroes to look to. And that was their exact words. So they certainly thank you for that. And again, for the record, my books were stolen. They didn't borrow them. I don't think I'll ever see them again. They stole them from me. So anyway, we don't have to go into that. So
They're
I,
like my heroines. They're flawed at times, but
yeah.
you still have to admire their spunk.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to leave the rest of the story for the listeners, but I also want to leave you with the last word. As you're going through, I'm not sure how long it took you to research this and write it, but as you're going through and you're learning about these women and you're deciding probably which ones to focus on and which ones not, was there anything that stood out to you? Was there any particular woman or moment that just really just made an impression on you? And the last thing I'm going to ask you is, what was the motto of the ATA?
All right. Well, uh, when I started this project, it was very hard to learn anything about
Right.
these because there hadn't been anything written about them. Uh, One of the first things I did was I went to the San Diego Air and Space Museum because I knew the names of one of the pilots,
Mm.
and I Googled it and found out that they had her papers in their collection.
Oh,
When I got there, the librarian told me I was the only person who'd ever asked to see them. I opened it
yeah.
up. I was blown away by her story. It was
Right.
dramatic. She had achieved so much. After the war, a movie was made about her life starring Lana Turner.
Oh, wow.
That dramatic and glamorous. I got to the end of the file and I found her obituary. It ran in a small newspaper in Idaho. It was 3 sentences. It didn't even mention that she knew how to fly.
Wow.
But I am on a mission here to make sure people find out about this phenomenon. And so bit by bit,
Yeah.
uh, most didn't have papers in libraries. I tracked down members of families and they went into their attics and found diaries and letters. And that's where you're getting all that personal information because those were a gold mine of information about the job and about their lives. So That I think that was a key moment when I first discovered how fascinating one of them was,
Right.
and I was about to learn that they all were fascinating in different ways.
Right. I'm going to say this because I try to remember to say this at the end of each interview. When someone comes along and they option this for a movie, just invite me. I will carry your luggage. I'll drive your car. I just want to be on the set because you know it's going to be cool. So just keep Ray in mind when that happens, okay? Because this is going to be an incredible. It was an incredible story. It'd be great on the big screen anyway. So that's all I wanted to say. But
You
I
can come walk the red carpet when they
there we
talk.
there we go.
You
I will
asked
whatever.
me about the motto, which I
Yes,
didn't.
please.
The motto of the ATA was eager for the air.
Right.
That's what these women were. The air represented so much to them. It represented freedom, it represented challenge, it represented danger.
Right.
It,
Yeah.
it represented everything that meant so much to them. And they were eager for the air and remained eager for the air all their lives. This was the highlight of their lives for every single one of them.
Well said. And I remember being 18 once when you sought out danger. Well, they found their danger and they persevered. So again, all these ladies in their own way are our heroes. And just again, thank you for this book. Thank you for taking the time to tell the story that was lost. A lot of people out there are going to appreciate it. And again, and I like the way that you put it in the historical context, because not only do they have these various adventures, it affected the larger war, it affected what Britain was able to do. So you put it in its context, and I enjoyed that very much. So for everybody else out there, the book is Spitfires: The American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II. Becky, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for this book.
Thank you. And thank your daughters for me.
I certainly will.